Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me, to our hosts at SharePoint Saturday, the artist formerly known as SharePoint Saturday Philly, M365 Philly. Day 3 of 3. I hope you're all kind of happy so far with how things are going. This plane is flying to Phoenix. If you're not flying to Phoenix, do not be aboard this plane. Part of the conversation. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about the new multilingual publishing capability for SharePoint communication sites. So super excited. This has been a long time coming. We'll talk about that when we talk history and a little bit of background, and we'll go from there. So a quick introduction. Is SharePoint. You know how to speak SharePoint. We're going to talk about the multilingual publishing capabilities. A quick intro to me. Always try to do SharePoint Saturday Philly, from Philly. Dyed in the wool like 30 years, etc. My background, I'm just so you're aware, you're not going to get a 400 level developer session from me. You're going to get probably a 200 level business centric session from me. So I'm a recovering CPA, a lapsed PMP. So I've done a lot of project management and implementations, but I've been doing Microsoft things, implementations for about 20 years, and been doing SharePoint focused things for about the last 14. So I've been fortunate to spend about the last 3.5 years on one set of projects, really, for a pharma company that got integrated and then got bought and got integrated again. So the biggest internet project I've worked on in my life, over 50,000 users, and an enormous amount of complexity, some of which we'll talk about because it's relevant to this history with multilingual. So you can find me on Twitter at Mike Gill. I will post a copy of my slides afterward and put a link to it in my Twitter account. I'm pretty active on there on SharePoint things. So feel free to tune in if you wish. And thank you again for having me. So let's talk about what we'll cover, right? Intro you got. We're going to talk a little bit about history because I think it's important. You know, they say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. So we're going to see some kind of some historical trends here. We'll talk about what's new, what was released in May, and how it works differently from what we've done before in multilingual scenarios. I'll walk through demo scenarios by role. So what do you need to know and do as a site owner? What do you need to know and do as a translator? And what do you need to know and do as a consumer? As a consumer, the good news is your job's pretty easy. But if you want to consume content in more than one language, there are a couple things that would probably be useful for you to know. We'll talk about some tips, tricks, and gotchas, some things that have bitten us a little bit as we've been among the early implementers of Microsoft's multilingual publishing, and some advice on ways to mitigate those. And I'll leave you with, we'll leave time for questions at the end, and I'll leave you with some resources from a lot of people who have been contributing a great deal to the community on this topic. Folks like DC Perdure from the product team, and Daniel Glenn and Sebastian Levere have a very good podcast that they did about multilingual, and of course Sue Hanley's content is world class in this area as well. We'll talk about all of that. So I put the graphic in here. So this is a little timeline, a little history of multilingual, and I know there's a little bit of a delay for the screen to repaint. So if you're not seeing what I'm saying, just put something in the Q&A so I'm aware of it in the meeting chat. But it was back in 2007 when Microsoft released language variations for SharePoint publishing, and the way they did that is what you see in this diagram. They used variation sites. So there was a root site, and then there was a top site for the English label, and then subsites, and then subsites of subsites, and then subsites of subsites. So there was also a German language variation. So I'll talk you through the URL string a bit, just so you can see what those variations look like and how they've changed. So we wandered through that desert for about 10 years, actually more than 10 years, right? From when it was released in 2007, the first bit of major change is Microsoft releasing modern communication sites, right? Back in June, the middle of 2017. The key there was the subsite idea, the notion of subsites started to erode a bit. Much flatter information architectures in modern communication sites than we were used to seeing in the classic, more hierarchical subsite driven thing. So the first inflection point is Microsoft's release of modern communication sites. Still no multilingual for modern communication sites in 2017, nor in 2018. So the project that we were on required that we have a multilingual intranet, modern multilingual intranet, up and running for January 8th of 2019. The challenge there is that it was a full, 14, 15 months before Microsoft was going to release theirs. So we built it. We built what became the PNP open source multilingual solution. So if you're familiar with the Microsoft Patterns and Practices open source community, there is a multilingual publishing solution that's been out there since April of 2019, and it's what we wrote on our project to be able to do this in January of 2019 when Microsoft wasn't going to have theirs for another 15 months or so. So the PNP solution is still out there. It's available to everybody, although now that Microsoft has released out-of-the-box capability that mimics it, and a lot of it is very consistent and compatible because we got a lot of good advice from Microsoft when we built this and committed it to the open source community. So this year, Microsoft targeted release in March, worldwide release in May. So now we've got, GA generally available, Microsoft out-of-the-box multilingual publishing for modern communication sites. So that's a little bit about how we got here. So some of the mechanics of the change, sometimes it's easiest to show this to you in terms of URLs. So the classic sites in terms of variations, you can see that the structure, the site collection of news, the site for the German language variant for that, the DEDE, and then the site News Center 1, and the pages on that site. And then other subsites for English language or any other language. The project we worked on, we supported 8 languages on day 1. The difference from the classic with site variations and subsites for each language to modern in both the PNP and the Microsoft Multilingual Publishing is that it's all in the same site. It's contained inside of folders in the site pages library for each language. Now our PNP solution had the 4-character language string, the language and the locality, in case you had Portuguese from Portugal and Portuguese from Brazil. There are sometimes minor variations between the languages in there. Microsoft's at the bottom, the modern MLP one, just uses the 2-language folder construct. So we got out of subsites via variations, and we got into site pages and folders to store our multilingual content. So this is what some of Microsoft's announcement entailed, right? Multilingual publishing for modern sites, got it. Not new news to us. So real focus on enterprise class organizations, global communications. To me, that implies usually thousands or tens of thousands of users. An organization that has an internal communications function and has, real scale in how they communicate internally, transmit news and other content. So that the second piece of that, right? Enterprise customers, what was in their scope, in scope of this solution is supporting multilingual pages and news and modern communication sites. Talked about the no locale differentiation, just the 2. And this does not include auto translation. So they don't use a tool like Microsoft Azure Cognitive Services or Google Translate to translate content in line real time. And you're starting to see that in other places in Microsoft. We know this, right? From Stream's ability to extract content, to create the written record of content, and then to translate that using Azure Content. There are services available that are doing that. That is not in this scope at this time. And it's also important to understand the multilingual user interface, or the MUI components. So the page content owned by the Multilingual Publishing that we manage very, in great detail, and the user interface components like site titles, navigation, system commands, etc., that are managed by Microsoft via the MUI based on your language settings in your user profile. So multilingual collaboration experiences for team sites, not in the scope of this. This is very oriented toward communication sites and publishing. Also not in scope, permissions controlled regional content variations, or the classic variations feature, right? There's no modern replacement for that. There is something completely new. So the translation from site to site, subsite, subsite of a subsite, et cetera, into this new modern paradigm, I don't think, and based on having migrated thousands of sites off of those classic sites, there's no good automated scripted way of doing that that supported our use case. If you've got real expertise in PowerShell or other scripting languages, you may have different results from what we did, but there's no, to my knowledge, there's no clean migration because the structures are just so inherently different. Things like permissions, inheritances across subsites versus in the site pages. There's a lot of differences in there that don't translate particularly well. So we're starting new in a lot of ways. So most of this I think we covered. The new capability, language variations. It's intended for comm sites, not team sites. There are flows baked into this. So the translator role, if I'm identified as a translator, I'm going to get notifications that there's something for me to translate. Then the owner of the master page is going to get a notification that there's newly translated content, etc. So those flows are also a component of this. But I think the rest of this we have we've mostly covered. So I'm going to go into the site owner role. Like we got three major roles here: owner, translator, and consumer. And I'll show you a little bit of each via screenshots and some narrative, and then we'll toggle over and we'll do a quick demo for each. The first and most critical thing I need to do from the new site creation dialog, creating a new communication site, is specify a default language. In our case, English was the default language. In a lot of cases, we have a significant presence in Japan at the company that I'm working at. And it probably makes sense if you're creating a communication site in Japan to have that default language be Japanese, because the key thing, two key things about selecting the language when you create the site: one, you can't change it later. And two, everything you publish that you intend to be multilingual, you have to first publish in the default language. So there is a redirect component at the default language page. So if I'm going to the site and I go to the news page and I'm going to the English page and my default language is English, I will see the page. If I go to the English page and it's the default and my default language is Spanish, and there happens to be a Spanish language page, I will be redirected at that time. So creating the site and specifying that default language in a thoughtful way is going to be really important, because if I am a communications person in Japan, I probably don't want to have to first publish everything in English and then translate it to Japan. If I've built a site whose audience is Japanese speaking, and maybe secondarily or maybe not at all English content. So that is a really important thing that happens up front. The second is for a site owner, going into site settings, language settings, and it opens up this screen. When I toggle the enable pages and news to be translated to on, I see the rest of the screen. So I have the ability in here, the dialog, to add or remove site languages and identify translators. I can remove languages from here, and there's one advanced setting that merits a quick note, quick conversation. So in that advanced setting, it doesn't show it here. The overwrite site translations, if I'm in, say, I'm in a site, the default language is English. There is a Spanish language version of the page that I'm on as well. I make changes to the Spanish language version. Actually, if I make changes to the navigation, it's probably the most prevalent use case for this. If I make changes to the navigation in the Spanish language version, other Spanish language users will see that. English language users will see the English language nav. But when I change the master language user, so maybe I want to change the site navigation in English, this advanced setting dictates whether that overrides any changes that were made to other language translations, or the localized versions stay the same no matter what I do in the master language. So the default is set to no, I believe, where if once it's translated into a local language, it won't be overwritten by the master language user, but depending on how you run things, you can specify this to. So probably easier to show you some of this than to tell you. So let me show you. I'm going to toggle over to our demo as the site owner, and we're actually going to create a new multilingual site. I do want to ask Ashley, if you're on the line still, just to give me a sense of the lag that we're talking about. I want to make sure what I'm saying is syncing up okay from the external user's perspective.
Yeah, so I think the lag in general is on the slides as well as the audio. So I think that everybody's going to be caught up, to where they are. But I don't see any questions or anything published at the moment. So you're looking good. I think you're still good to go.
Okay, thank you. So from SharePoint Home, I'm going to create a site. I'm going to create a new communication site. I'm going to call it M365 Philly ML test site. Space this out because I know that SharePoint gives me a nice clean site address. When I do that, I can say it's a demo. SPS Philly. My default language, English. I'm going to let it create the site. Bingo, I've got a new communication site. I'm going to go into the site settings and enable multilingual publishing. Click on the gear, site information, view all site settings, language settings. Here is the screen that we talked about before. Site languages, if it's turned off, I don't see anything. If it's turned on, I start to get options. I want to add a language. I'll make Spanish the language of this site. I can add translators. I'll add myself. My Simpraxis self. I'm in a Calacrity. I'm in a different demo tenant. I might actually add my Calacrity self, make it easier. If I wanted to add others, French, for example, I might add my colleague Julie Turner. As a translator, she speaks French a lot better than I do. I can remove the language here. This is the advanced setting that we talked about. I'm going to leave that alone for now. So I've enabled multilingual for this site. I've specified these couple of languages, and I've specified the translators. So when I save this, and I don't know about you, but when I go into a newly created site, it gives me just kind of the default site template. I do a little bit of housekeeping right away. If I don't want the hero, I'll get rid of that, and I'll just elevate news to the top of the page. So it just makes it a little easier for us to just get rid of the hero section. Now I've got news in the top part, the top section of the page, and I'm going to create a new, well, yeah, I'll go in and I'll create a new news post.
Hey, Mike, we do actually have one question.
Yep.
All right, so we have, where does the site pull your language settings from? The computer in the browser or from your profile?
The site uses the SharePoint user profile language settings in there. Like, I definitely know that the multilingual publishing uses that user profile setting. The MUI, so the system commands, like let me cancel this. The system commands like new translation, page details, etc., comes from the multilingual user interface, which I believe is still set by your user profile settings. I mean, user profile settings, I believe, default to what your Windows settings are. And I do have a couple slides on that and a little bit of narrative about, as a user, changing your language settings a little farther down in this presentation. So I'll touch on that a bit more, but if that doesn't answer the question, let's loop back at the end as well.
Thank you.
Sure. I'm going to create a new news post. When I go to create new content in here, new multilingual content, especially if I'm really going to be focused on news, I try to do it from the news web part. I try to specify there that it is a news post. The reason for not doing it from, say, site pages is we want to be really careful if we're creating a master page and then translated pages. We want them to all be the same, either site pages or news pages. Having a combination of both, where the source page is a site page, but the translated pages are news pages. Bad for roll-ups, potentially bad user experience, and there's some caveats in my later slides on that. So I'm just going to create this page. I'm going to go, this is, Phillies win World Series again. So anybody who is in fact from Philly will know that that's pretty unlikely, but that's okay. We'll do a quick web search, give us a nice image. So take a moment. This guy as my banner. And add text here. I do have some Lipsum handy. I'll just pull that up in another window and copy it in. Bear with me one moment. I'm going to paste that in. Do my little bit of housekeeping. If I like turn off comments, you will note now I have a translation button because I've enabled translation of this page. Let me just fix my focal point. Go. And post this news. Your posting process may vary from this. Some people don't want to post if English is my default or master language. People may not want to post that first. They may want to wait until everything is ready and post it all together. So I can either post this now, go back and inform people that they need to translate it, or I can save it as a draft, go into site pages, group select the source page and all the translated pages and publish them together. So I'm going to publish this guy for now just to give us an initial news post out there. So very easy to get set up and to get started with the translation. So if I go back into that page and then I click translation, I will get the option of the languages that I set up when I first set up translation for this. So neither of these has been started yet. I can do this in bulk for all of them, or I can just pick one if I want to. And now it's created and saved a new draft translation of this page. I want to go there. It will actually tell me translate into Spanish, right? So it will bring that in. And if I do Phillies win World Series, copy that guy over and edit this page, do my translation effort right here. And I think I cut some off, but that's fine. It gives us the idea. Then I can either save it as a draft or post it. I'll post this straight away. When I come back to this site and refresh it, my news should be refreshed in here. I only see the English language version of this. I'm in here as an English language user. I'm looking at an English language version of the page. The news roll-up web part knows to only serve me news articles that are denominated in English. If I go into that news article and I toggle the language to see the Spanish language version, it's going to open that up for me. So this top right language picker is where I can make my toggle real easily from English to Spanish. I'm not changing my user profile settings. I'm not changing my browser settings. I'm just changing the translation version of the page that I'm seeing real quickly through the UI here. All right, let's go back and talk a little bit about the translator role. So what are the things that happen to me as a translator? First thing, when I'm named as a translator, I get a notification saying, hey, you've been named a translator for this site. I can go in and translate site nav and applicable hub nav if it's a hub site. And then all the other users who have the same default language as me will see the same thing in the site nav. Again, unless I've overridden that in the site settings, the advanced settings that we talked about. When there's new content for me to translate, I'll see the notice that you see on the right-hand side. It looks a lot like a flow notice because that's how it's getting to me, right? A flow is fired off, sends me an email saying, you're the translator, there's new stuff for you to translate, click here and start translating. So I already kind of demoed the perform and publish the translations, and then if the original or source content is changed, so that Phillies win the World Series article is changed, there was some sort of factual error in there or something that needed to be fixed, the source page gets updated. I'll also get a notification that, hey, that page that you translated, it's been updated since. Do you want to translate it again? So those are the key things I get as a translator. So what are the scenarios? What do I do? A newly created page to translate, the updates, translation published, or translation of the nav. Those are the things I do as a translator. And again, the really important thing, all pages have to be created in that default and primary language. And that default and primary language selection is really crucial. I'm gonna state that a couple times in a couple different ways to emphasize it a bit. So I kind of went through this a little bit before. Let me just toggle over to our site. If I am the translator, let's look at translation. This is published. There's something wrong with my timestamp because it says it's published in 3 hours. I was seeing that. So again, if I publish the original English language on the page owner or the news owner for this site, and I want something to be translated, I'm going to specify that the French version be translated. If I am the translator, I get an alert, and it's going to take me to this page. Phillies win the World Series, translated into French. I'll get the top page hasn't been translated, edit to start translation. If I edit, I can do the same here. In this case, I'm going to edit it. I'm going to change this into French. Fix my typo. Copy that. I've got my edit going here. I'm just going to paste that in. And I'm going to save this one as a draft. Not going to publish that yet. That's going to be a scenario we should look at in a little while. So maybe it's not ready. Maybe it needs to go through a different rev or different review process. If you've got a local MD who wants to see any news before it gets published, understand if the translation works okay, if some sort of QA step in there from, I take the basic translation from Google Translate, but I have a professional or a native speaker look at that because the automated translation isn't always precise. That may be another reason to save these as a draft and go back and publish them later. So pretty easy scenario for the translator. I get the notification, I get the content, I make the translation, I either save it as a draft or I publish it. And then as a reader or a consumer, the main thing is that set or change your default language. So this is a bit about the question that came up earlier. It's 6 steps. It should be a lot easier than it is, and we'll talk about that. So I'm gonna toggle out and show you how that gets done, changing your default language as a user. I go to my Delve profile and update my profile. I'm going to dig in from here to how can I change language and regional settings, click the drop down, then click on the terrible thing that says click here, which usability experts hate links that say click here. Tried for accessibility purposes, that's really awful user design. But anyway, I come to this edit details screen and it is still buried yet farther down under this ellipsis under language and region. So I have the display language of English set as my default here. I can set Spanish as a secondary one. If I know I'm going to be consuming and or creating content in another language, this is a place for me to do that. Spanish, Spain, usually we use, yep, we use Spanish, US, okay. I'll add that. You can change the order of these. A couple, I'm going to actually add French as well. French. Make sure I save all and close. So that is where, I mean, these are the steps. So I dropped it into this slide to make it nice and easy. One thing to be aware of when you change your language settings. So if I had changed my default language to be Spanish, for example, it'll probably be about 15 minutes or so before the MUI items, the user interface, the Microsoft Multilingual user interface items change. So my system settings, menus, etc., that are system driven, as opposed to content that I've published using the Multilingual, which I'll see right away. So the language settings take a little while to propagate. In my experience, up to about 15 minutes or so. The thing I would advocate for, this requires a little bit of development, but if your developers understand SharePoint user profiles, it's pretty easy to create. I shouldn't say it's easy, but what we did was we created a My Work component in a global navigation that we did, and within that My Work component, there's a My Profile where users can set their time zone, their language preferences, and other preferences from the user profile. So I think an easier to get to screen makes for a much nicer user experience, but I realize that not everybody has the dev resources to make that happen. So these are the steps for doing it through the user interface as well. Any questions so far? Ashley, anything else come up before we get into tips, tricks, and gotchas?
Yeah, so we have another one. Can you translate the home page on the site as well? For example, the text over the images or the events, etc.
Sure, let's go into that. Let's take a look. I'm going to go here. I'm going to go back to my multilingual demo. I'm going to back to the home site page, not the news page that I was on. I definitely have the ability to translate this page as well. I can create a Spanish language version of this page. So the content will have to be translated in each of the containers, each of the components. It works best for news, but you can have, a text editor web part with content in here that you translate across languages. It's a little choppier for events and documents and the like, but you can absolutely do that. And the system components, like the header news, the web part name for events, news, documents, see all, etc., that changes based on the MUI, the multilingual user interface from Microsoft that controls all of the system things. That's the thing I said might take about 15 minutes if you change your default language to Spanish. So yes, you can translate not just news pages, you can translate any site page. It's a question of what are the components of that page, how are they going to look, and what translation is that going to require of you as a site owner or a translator. Anything else?
Nope, not for now.
So this part is the it's too late for me, save yourself part of the presentation. So there are lessons learned anytime you use new software, things that aren't as done as you thought they would be or just don't work the way you expected them to. So a couple places where we can provide some recommendations and things to look out for. So I think we've beaten this one up pretty well, the MUI components versus the MLP components, right? The MUI components, the system components that you're talking about here, system menus, those types of things, a lot of it at the top of the screen, the multilingual publishing components, the page content itself, right? That distinction is going to be important for you to know as you test and work on publishing multilingual content. A place to add effort. This is a big one. It's hard to test multilingual if you don't know multiple languages. I know a little bit of Spanish that I learned in high school and learned from playing baseball for many years with a lot of Spanish-speaking friends. But if you don't know this really well, highly recommend creating a service account for each language that you're going to use. A, it speeds your trip a little bit. You're not waiting that 10 or 15 minutes for settings to propagate. B, if you're working with, as we did, Japanese language speakers, if you toggle your default language to Japanese, it's very hard to remember how to get back out and change those settings again, back to English if you're a native English speaker. So those service counts by language, and then just create a browser profile for each one that caches those credentials. I think that's going to save you a lot of time and effort, and you'll be happy you did. The other thing, consider and bake in your time to translate. So this is, if you're already using multilingual, this isn't a big deal. You're used to this. So it's the news publishing effort times N, with N being the number of languages you've got. So if I had previously an English only site, my time to content creation, to review and QA and publishing was a couple of hours. If now I have to translate that same content 8 times and have it QA'd, either I use a mechanical translator like Azure Cognitive Services, and then populate it, and then probably have a native speaker eyeball it. You've got to think about that in your news publishing processes. It has the potential to extend that time in ways that you need to plan for. So plan for that. And I also mentioned the bulk publish capability. So within site pages, if I select unpublished, and I can see the minor versions of these in the view that I have in site pages. So I can tell they're unpublished because they have non-whole number versions. I can also tell because the promoted state is 1. And for those folks who don't know promoted state of 0 is a site page. Promoted state of 2 is a news page. Promoted state of 1 is an unpublished news page, an aspiring promoted state 2 or news page. So creating a couple of basic views in your site pages library, and I'll speak to this in a little more depth in a moment, is going to save you a lot of time and effort and make it really efficient. You drop in the translation language column, you drop in the item language column, version, and promoted state, and you're going to get some really meaningful and useful stuff when you're doing multilingual publishing. A couple things to test thoroughly and be aware of. Rollups, so the native rollups, like the news rollup, the news web part that you saw on my homepage, the news component in the SharePoint start page, those work really well at only serving up the language-specific instances of the content that are based on the language that I'm logged, that I use. Things like highlighted content, I would want to test that pretty thoroughly, because depending on how you've configured the highlighted content web part, depending on what you've made managed properties on the content that you're trying to roll up, you could get, if it's news articles or if it's pages, you could get the same thing showing up multiple times in different languages inside of the same roll-up web part. So it's a thing to test out and be aware of. Hub sites, I believe, and I didn't do a multilingual hub site for this demo. I think most of that's been ironed out, but there's some resources that I'll point you to that I think we can check and make sure. I saw some feedback about auto digest emails. So the auto digest capability to send out a news digest or news summary that you can do from right within the news web part. I haven't tested to see if those emails are smart enough to only send you the digest in your, the language that you choose. I'd be surprised. So if there were 5 users, I wanted to send them all a news digest of my news from this site, and 2 of them were English speakers, 2 Spanish and 1 French. I don't think the auto digest capability is smart enough to parse that out, but that's one I want to test more thoroughly. I saw some comments on that in either user voice or the community. And the mobile experience, initially I saw not working at all around the time of release. I see it working fine now. I actually looked at this last night to prepare for today. The one thing I cannot do on the mobile app is toggle my language. I think the mobile app is going to default to the language that I specified in my user profile, and I cannot find a place to change that in line on a mobile device using the mobile app. Could probably do it if I just toggled over to use the browser instead, but I don't believe the mobile app has the capability yet to let me toggle my language for a given page, a given multilingual page. I'd love to be proven wrong on that. If anybody knows differently, please put something into the chat or let me know. So things that are kind of like yellow light, I would do these. These should work, but I would test them. And some other considerations. So now that you've got a source page in your default language and translated pages, be really careful about deleting that source page and not deleting the orphaned language translation pages, because all the flows break. The flow saying, hey, I have something new to translate, well, that goes away, right? Because the source is gone. So you kind of get zombie translation pages, which you can continue to edit. They're just not going to tie out to a master. They're going to be out of sync and out of phase with that. I think we talked a little bit before about the news pages or site pages distinction. So everything in a group of pages that's translated should either be all news pages, promoted state of 2, or site pages, promoted state of 0. And that promoted state is the way to see that easily in your site pages library. Before we go to the next, I actually wanted to show you that because I did create that for this demo. The site pages. So this is linked. The instructions for how to do this are linked in an article by Sue Hanley on her blog, which I have a link to later in this presentation. We've been using this extensively on the project that we're working on together. Matter of fact, if you use a site design or say templates from like PAL or somebody, PAL 365, to create templates for new sites, I would make this part of your default template for multilingual sites so that it's in there by default. So what I had to do here is I created it manually. I created a view called all pages, no folders, and I added those components that are multilingual specific. The promoted state is useful to know, what's published, what's not published. The version number is important, and the translation language and item language are important to know. So this gives me that capability to pick the unpublished pages and bulk publish them. So now I'll see that promoted state toggle to 2, the version toggle to 1.0, and now users will see that content when I've published it. So this view of site pages is a real useful thing if you're doing multilingual publishing. Some of you may have seen this next item slow down when creating new pages. You may have seen this when you're trying to add a title or a banner image on a new page, and it ends up saving as like site pages /yxx0929.aspx. It'll resolve when you enter a title in and you give it a moment or a couple moments. It will save the a good URL, replace that kind of placeholder with a descriptive URL based on the title of the page that you created. Make sure you get that good URL before you hit the translate button, because if you hit the translate button first, you're going to get that temporary placeholder URL as a component. You're going to get however n number of languages with that page URL. So just slow down, take a moment, make sure that URL populates cleanly before you translate. And the other thing is there is a redirect. Remember I said every multilingual page needs to get published in its default language first. So only add the primary page URLs to navigation. If you're creating quick links, etc., don't point directly to the Spanish translation or the French translation or the Lithuanian translation. Point to the primary page. The redirector will do its job. The redirector queries the user to understand the browser language, the user profile language, etc., and serve up the right page. So you don't need to do that. Make sure in navigation you add only the primary page URLs. And if all this feels like way overkill for you, you have no appetite for it, way too complex, there are poor man's options. You can create a 2-column layout with language 1 in one column and language 2 in another column. You can create sections containing translated content and then use anchor tags to create a table of content at the top. So before Microsoft Multilingual was available out of the box, some folks in our Canadian branch wanted multilingual. We didn't want to incur more technical debt to use our custom multilingual. So we used the translated sections. So there was an English section of the page, but at the very top of the page in a little table of contents was a link to the French language content on the page as well. So didn't require multilingual publishing, didn't require all these workflows, etc., but it solved the immediate problem. So it was a simpler way of doing this. I don't think it's going to fit every use case, but it fit that very simple one for us before the out of the box was enabled. So Ashley, I'll toggle to you one more time. Are there any other questions?
Nope, no new questions, and it looks like we're right, smack on time here, so everything's looking good.
Cool. If I could take like 2 minutes to wrap up. There are a lot of resources that I used in putting this together and that I refer back to. I would say the top one and the bottom one are crucial. So Microsoft, when they released Multilingual, put out a really good guide for creating and managing these. And Sue Hanley has taken that and, based on the practical work that we've done together on this, has synthesized this into 7 tips to create and manage multilingual communication sites. So some of the things that we talked about are in those 7 steps. Create that view. Don't link to translated things and all of those things. So Sue's article is outstanding. The Microsoft thing is really comprehensive documentation. Highly recommend it. But I'll post all these slides via a tweet later today, so you'll have access to all of these links in line. There is feedback is really welcome. It's very hard to present a virtual event and not get that direct engagement and feedback from the audience. So anything you can recommend to me as a speaker via the left-hand QR code, or to the event organizers who've worked really hard on this and done a fantastic job. We really could use your feedback. We appreciate it. And thank you. Want to thank everybody for taking some time, especially the organizers and the sponsors who made this possible. And it's extraordinary times, right, for us to have to do these things remotely, but very grateful for the opportunity, and I hope this was helpful.
All right, thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Ashley.